So here's the title. I think we intend this to be really, really informal. So actually, I have slides, but you know, if you want to stop me, we can talk, and I'll make sure that I leave plenty of time for Arun. So as Sally mentioned, the university has launched a new initiative in natural gas. So I wanted just to maybe say a couple of things about that, because Mark couldn't be here, and he sent me an email and said, please say something about it. So I will. It's an interesting initiative because it was very much sort of bottom up, and the idea was to try and get as much interest across the university as possible. So you see the schools that have faculty that are represented, and I didn't try to do the institutes because I was sure I would get something wrong, and so I thought it was better not to do that. But the kind of the topics of interest go from resource development to environmental impacts, uses or sort of like downstream uses of natural gas, global markets and finance, policy and regulatory reform, and geopolitical impacts, right? So this is a huge endeavor in terms of scope. And on the top you see really the kind of the main thing here is to engage faculty from across the university to think about in a way sort of the full range of questions associated with natural gas. So this is cutting off the top. But again, in terms of sort of thinking about the motivations for for this effort, the world in 2050 is going to be much different than the world today in terms of number of people, in terms of the energy services that those people are going to need, and there are real questions about how those energy services are going to be delivered, and so this is part of the question that perhaps natural gas contributes to is how are we going to provide energy for basically a developed world in a way that's affordable, accessible, and environmentally friendly, I guess we could say. So I'll just I'll just say a few things about why natural gas. We could think about why now and the need for a transition fuel, but I'll focus more just on the why natural gas question. So this is a plot of basically increasing demand for energy services. It's interesting when I teach a class, energy and environment, and the US on this scale consumes 100 quads, and it used to be that you said, well, the US consumes about a quarter of the world's energy because the world at that time only needed about 400 quads in total. Now the US still only consumes about 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy, but the world consumes about 500 quads. So it's basically going up year over year, and a big part of that energy is being delivered in the form of coal. So this is coal use sort of going up year over year. This is, as you probably all know, is really driven by coal consumption in China, and there is an interesting trend sort of illustrated here. So this is CO2 emissions in billions of metric tons. U.S. CO2 emissions actually from coal leveled off and have actually declined recently. This is largely through the substitution of natural gas for coal. Okay, well, in the meantime, you see, China has really been driving a lot of its energy needs by increasing consumption of coal. So, this is, again, one of the questions we think about. Well, if we can, do some fuel substitution, perhaps we can have, a trend like this or turn around some of these other trends. So this is a picture of Shanghai in, in a particularly smoggy period. Some people have suggested that even if there are not so great of climate benefits from a switch from coal to natural gas, the other environmental benefits could be as equally as great, because a lot of this pollution is, driven by particulates in the atmosphere, and natural gas is a much cleaner burning fuel. So, you can look at health costs in the U.S., costs from coal-fired power generation that's affecting health, about $62 billion per year, and that's year over year. Okay, and again, adaptation to pollution really can only go, kind of so far. So sort of that background, as part of the launch for the Natural Gas Initiative, there was a symposium held here on campus, and it had a combination of invited keynote speakers and panel discussions. So what I'm going to do with my time here today is tell you a little bit about the panel that I chaired, which you can't read it, but it's entitled Upstream Challenges. The panelists were Ben Vanderbroel from Shell, Velo Kruskra, who's the president of Advanced Resources International, Paul Krishna, who is, his title is issue manager, but he thinks about environmental issues for XTO Energy, which is a subsidiary of Exxon, and Ram Shenoy, who is the chief technology officer for ConocoPhillips. So those are all very industrial people. So, just kind of keep that in mind when we talk about some of the perspectives that they shared. So the panel discussion really kind of broke down to really on a couple of themes. We talked about methane emissions, okay? We talked about the fact that there are now enough hydraulic fractures that have been put in place that basically the industry knows that about 1 in 3 hydraulic fractures don't perform as designed. And I'll talk about this in 2 slides, but the really interesting perspective that I got from the gentlemen on our panel is that they really see this as an opportunity. They don't see it as a problem. They see this as a great opportunity for improvement. And then if all of these things about natural gas replacing coal are going to come to be, then the resource really needs to be there for the shift. And that was something that was talked about, the size of the resource and the quality of the resource. And then we sort of ended up with their perspective on whether they believed that gas provided a credible pathway towards cleaner development. So I'm watching the time. So the issue, if you're not familiar with methane leakage directly to the atmosphere, is that on, say, a 20-year time frame, the global warming potential for methane is more than 80 times that of carbon dioxide, right? So a direct leak of methane to the atmosphere has some significant issues for climate. And I guess the data around methane leakage is still evolving, but I think the good news is that the industry believes that basically this trend is the trend that's evolved. So blue is showing shale gas production in trillions of cubic feet per year in the US, sort of ramping up from 2008 when things began till 2012. And the black line are, methane emissions. So, and then these are, in teragrams of CO2 equivalent. So the good news is, right, that although the amount of shale gas production is going up, they believe through sort of increased monitoring that they've actually got a handle on leaks and all those sorts of problems. Mm-hmm.
Is the CH4 decline per unit of output or total for the U.S.? We can't read the label there.
So that would be like a total. It's intended to be like a total, right? So total gas production from shale is going up. Total methane leakage is decreasing. Okay, and there's somewhat of an arbitrary standard that the industry has. The big players have sort of agreed to, in that they're going to try very hard to measure and monitor to make sure that they're below a 1% leak rate, basically from reservoir to burner tip, as they would say. So there's an industry initiative to make sure that occurs. Okay. So again, the numbers for methane emissions are a bit. People are still talking about, how much natural gas really leaks. So there's a fairly good error bar on these numbers. But again, this is what the industry believes that it's achieving. Okay. So this topic of when we first said we should talk about this, that basically one in three hydraulic fractures don't really work. I was a little concerned about that. Because I wasn't sure how that conversation was going to go, but again they saw this as something that was in a way very hopeful, because it's a big enough problem that they have to, if basically a third of your work isn't productive, it's a big enough number that you have to address it, right? So even if they could just figure out the third of hydraulic fractures that don't work and don't do them, then you're basically achieving the same production with 2/3 the number of wells. So that's an efficiency improvement, as well as if you're achieving the same amount of production with 2/3 the number of wells, that means there's a third less hydraulic fracture rigs running. There's a third less water that's being produced, and all of those sorts of issues. So again, the sort of the good news with this number was large enough that they sort of felt that it had to be addressed. And then we talked a lot about technology, but it really kind of came down to two things. Better assessments, so understanding the resource better, so that you didn't even go into those zones that weren't going to produce good fractures. And then, better measurements and sensing and all of those kinds of things to actually understand the dynamics of, of hydraulic fractures as they're being put in place. So perhaps you could, take remedial measures, as you needed. Okay. And there was some talk about enhanced recovery techniques, but that's probably a bit farther down the line. But I just have one. Actually, I took it out. But if you want a number, the industry thinks that in a shale resource, that they, on average, recover about 25% of the gas in place. So about 3/4 of the gas is potentially not recovered. So there's a big kind of a carrot there to go after in terms of increasing the recovery factor, and again, getting more recovery from the same well, and then reducing your cost as well as your impacts. Okay, this goes. So resource in place is astounding, and the fraction of the resource that we believe we can recover changes. Okay, it also depends who you talk to. So take these numbers with a bit of a grain of salt. But if we look at you know, the U.S. natural gas consumption is about 27, say it's 30 TCF per year. And you look at sort of the gas in place around the world, and you know, if we can achieve, you know, reasonable recovery factors, 25, 30, 50%, there is the resource in place to sort of dramatically change the energy portfolio, right? So people will talk about, you know, the coal resource. There is, you know, hundreds of years of coal resource at current consumption rates, okay? When you add in all of the conventional and unconventional gas, there are as well at sort of current consumption rates, there is a lot of resource that's available, and it's really going to come down to, you know, what is technically recoverable. So if you add these two numbers up, unconventional gas and conventional gas, that's like 37,000 TCF, right? So at sort of U.S. consumption rates, that's many, many years.
The distinction between conventional gas and unconventional being the presence of methane?
So in this slide, unconventional gas would be gas held in a tight formation. So shale, coal bed methane, or what some people refer to as a tight sandstone. Conventional gas would be gas that's associated with oil, or a gas in a standalone reservoir, but in a reservoir that looks like a typical oil reservoir. So good.
Common composition?
Common compositions?
The two gases.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So, so a shale gas, when you produce it, looks generally like a reasonable produced natural gas, right? So you might have a little bit of CO2 in it. They're generally not sour, so there's generally not H2S, which can be a problem in some conventional gas reservoirs. Okay. So I want to, just in the interest of time, maybe I'll skip that. There's interesting stuff here, but so then, you know, this panel was interesting because you had sort of worldwide perspective, right? So people who'd grown up in Europe, people who'd grown up in India, people who work in U.S., people who worked in Europe, and you know, the question, you know, was, you know, does gas provide a credible pathway towards cleaner development? So the perspective that they shared is that there's typically been, I guess if you would say, a conflict between GDP growth and sort of environmental compliance. And granted, there's a lot of things in natural gas that need to go right for it to be a, you know, so you have to minimize leak rates, you have to worry about produced water and all those kinds of things. But sort of the, you know, the general consensus was that with natural gas, you don't have this really big competition between GDP growth and environmental compliance, right? Because in itself is a product that, you know, has a lot of intrinsic value and is in many ways easier. You know, the fuel that it's substituting for, coal, it's easier to use than say coal. And you know, so that was sort of the good news. Sort of the thing that kind of gave us all pause is that if you looked at, I didn't point it out, but if we looked at that map of global resources, in fact, China has huge unconventional gas resources, and they have really struggled to develop them. You know, they've applied some of the same techniques and the same ideas that have worked very well in the US, and they haven't worked as well there. So that means that we don't understand the resource that well, and that getting that resource to market is going to be difficult. So it was sort of, you know, there was the hopeful message And then there was sort of the reality that it hasn't been as easy outside of the U.S. as it has been inside the U.S. And it hasn't been easy inside the U.S. either to get to really bring on unconventional gas the way it has. So with that, I think I want to stop and turn it over to Arun, see if there's any maybe quick question we can address.
Were there any environmental organizations that participated in the symposium?
Yeah, so in fact, it was so my discussion group was not balanced with basically NGOs, but we had almost equal participation. And Fred Krupp, yeah, from
NRD, from EDF
Yeah.
was there.
In fact, we can go back.
Because I know they've put up numbers that don't seem to jive, at least with the methane leakage.
Well, I think the numbers that people say is they say that the leakage is greater than EPA estimates, although we don't know what it is. So again, I said the error bar on those numbers are fairly big, and everyone in this panel, these industry guys, would agree that it's really important to know, to get some data to know the leak rates. But yeah, if you look in this session just before, there's Alan Krupnick from and Fred Krupp actually was one of the keynote speakers. So it was a pretty good distribution of opinion, let's just say. Okay.
I was just really surprised to see Stanford be involved with this. My biggest question, I guess, is what you see as the benefit from switching to coal to natural gas as far as per kilowatt global warming potential. Because my understanding, it's slight, if anything, especially looking at a 20-year horizon. And if we're talking about going forward, how does this fit into the IPCC horizon where we need to have concentration pathways drastically reduced if we want to avoid some of the bigger consequences? And we're talking, I hope nobody's seriously talking about burning up all those reservoirs, because there's no scientific argument about what would happen, right?
Right. So natural gas, basically per unit of energy when you burn it, is about half the amount of CO2. Okay. So half. Yeah. So the CO2 produced per unit of energy is about half that of coal. Okay. So one of the topics that was talked about in sort of like technology that we need was talking about sequestration. There's also a lot of talk about hybrid. So how do you would have if you want to have an integrated energy system, right? Then it might not be that natural gas is providing all of what you need all the time, but it's the backing kind of thing. So there's lots of discussions about how you address exactly what you said. How do you have an energy portfolio that delivers sort of something that's economic with sort of the best
Also,
environmental consequences.
Leak detection and
Yeah.
mitigation too.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So yeah, those are all great things. Maybe we'll revisit those. You have one. Okay, cool. Do you want me to shut this down?
Yeah, just leave it there.
Okay.
Well, I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to talk. Unfortunately, you have to see me, watch me. So the panel that, as you can see, my panel was on the uses of natural gas. And we had a terrific panel, and we focused primarily on three topics. One is the power sector. The second is the manufacturing sector. This is the use of natural gas. And the third is transportation. And there are some other peripheral issues that I'll come to. But the power sector is actually quite a amazing transformation that is happening. We used to use 50% of our power, electrical power, from coal, and that has gone down to about 30-something%, whereas natural gas has gone up from 20-something to about 30-something. And that's been probably one of the most rapid transformation in the power sector. And this is primarily because of two things. One is the cost, and the second is potential regulations that may come for coal that are now starting to come. The cost issue. If you look at the cost of power generation from coal, it's roughly about 8 to 10 or 11 cents a kilowatt hour, roughly. On the other hand, if you look at natural gas, because they use what are called combined cycle turbines, these have got two in a topping cycle, bottoming cycle, their efficiency is on the order of about 60+%, whereas a coal-fired power plant, the maximum efficiency you can get today, and these are ultra supercritical coal-fired power plants in China, it's on the order of 42, 43, 44% or so. So the efficiency is much higher for these natural gas combined cycle turbines, and the feedstock cost, because the abundance is low and in fact separated from oil, and that's the big deal. The price of natural gas in the United States has separated from oil. So if you look at that, the cost of producing electricity from natural gas is about 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Okay, so that economics is a huge driver for transitioning to natural gas, and by the way, it's cleaner. And frankly, the economics has driven much of it, and with the fact that there are regulations, and this has been going on for the last 7 to 8 years or so, and now with the regulations coming, this has been a good transition in that sense.
What would be the cost comparison for China, for example, between natural gas and coal per kilowatt hour?
Yeah, so natural gas prices in China, in the United States is about $4 or $5 a million BTU. In China, I believe it's about $10 to $12 a million BTU, maybe some. It's higher than that, $15 a million BTU.
Cheaper for them to use coal.
It's cheaper for them to use coal. They're trying to get to natural gas because of pollution reasons. You saw the picture. And Beijing is, I think, probably worse than that, right? So I think pollution reasons are driving much of the thing. And
Saw that coal consumption for power generation was going up in China.
Right. So they are, I think they're driven to figure out how to reduce the pollution. That's more than the economics out there, because the people are breathing that all the time. So this big transition towards natural gas in the power sector brings up two issues. Number one is there are regions in this country, in particular the Northeast, where the infrastructure to deliver natural gas is not quite built up, because it was built up for the previous demand for natural gas. And this is typically felt when you have very cold winters. And last year was, the year before that, it was polar vortex, and the last winter was pretty bad too. And when you have really cold winters, the demand for natural gas goes up because of heating. Now, so the demand is high, but the supply is not quite there. So as a result, the price of natural gas goes up, the spot price. In fact, in certain regions, the spot price can go up to $20, $50 a million BTU, and then it comes down when the demand goes down. Now, which is, that's just because the infrastructure is not there. But if you also have electricity generation overly dependent on natural gas, what you find is when the spot price of natural gas goes up, the price of electricity generation goes up. So now you have a double whammy, basically, because you have two prices going up for the energy bill. And so that's an issue. And the question that we were asking, and there's no simple answer to this, how can we find cost-effective solutions that are socially acceptable? Who pays for the infrastructure? Does the market solve the problem? Are there other factors in it? And are there other challenges that we're going to face in the future? Because if you're going to go more and more towards natural gas, this problem is not going away. So that's something that we discussed in this panel. The other question that we had to ask ourselves is that, okay, natural gas is wonderful in terms of replacing coal and reducing emissions, but what does it do to the renewables? because the renewables, other source of electricity generation, does it displace it? Is it a good thing? And frankly, it's a bit of a both. Because if you have, one of the characteristics of renewables is that they're intermittent. Even if you have centralized facilities, utility scale solar or wind, they go up and down. So in many places, natural gas is used to sort of balance it out. And the reason being, as opposed to coal-fired power plants or nuclear plants, natural gas turbines, these combined cycle turbines, are somewhat like jet engines. They can be ramped up at 50 megawatts a minute at 60+% efficiency, which is terrific. And so they create a balancing act. So if the wind goes down, they ramp up the natural gas turbines. They are much better in ramping up. So in some sense, it's a good thing. And what is happening is that the price of natural gas electricity, or electricity from natural gas, is about 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And it's not going down. I mean, this is sort of the best you can do. On the other hand, the cost of electricity from renewables, if you just take the renewables without the added capacity that you have to build up, that is coming down. In fact, there are contracts, wind contracts that are being signed today at about $30 a megawatt hour, which is 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which is cheaper than coal. In fact, cheaper than natural gas sometimes. Solar costs are coming down. So in many ways, I don't think it's displacing to some extent, but it's not displacing enough of the renewables, which is not a bad thing. And in fact, it can have a beneficiary effect of balancing it out. The big challenge is on the nuclear side, because the cost of nuclear electricity is not coming down. In fact, the biggest cost is the construction cost. And they have to, if you don't consider subsidies, they have to compete with the electricity from natural gas. And that's a very tough competition. So if there's anything, I would say nuclear has a really hot competition on their hands in terms of whether it can be a decarbonized source of electricity in the future. So that's on the power generation. Let me just touch upon a little bit on manufacturing and then very briefly on transportation. Manufacturing is one of the best stories that is going on. I'll tell you why. Let me give you some numbers. Because of the low cost of natural gas, it has become, the chemical industry is actually coming back to the United States. And this is not only for heat generation for manufacturing, but also as a feedstock for chemical manufacturing. Here's some numbers. The US trade balance in the chemical industry was $9.4 billion deficit in 2005 in the chemical industry, $9.4 billion deficit in 2005, $3.4 billion surplus in 2013, in 8 years, and by 2018, it is expected that surplus to reach $30 billion, which is a terrific change of fortune out here. The American Chemistry Council has estimated about $70 billion in investment. This is already invested. And that will create 1.2 million jobs, direct or indirect. And so this is one of the best news stories that is happening. The question, we have, what are the global implications of this manufacturing and trade that's happening? We have, in fact, we just had a conference in Vail, in the Vail Global Energy Forum. We talked about, not just United States, but North America. So if this natural gas is bringing back industries out here, it'll have an impact not just in the United States, but Mexico, where a lot of the manufacturing gets done, and there's a lot of value add in the United States that comes back to the United States. So this is a very good regional thing that is happening, and I'm happy to sort of talk about it. And these are industries like, paper, chemical, plastics, rubber products, glass, iron and steel, aluminum, then foundries, metal products and industries, in addition to the chemical and the petrochemical stuff. On the transportation side, most of the natural gas today is used for long-haul trucking. And this is LNG, liquefied natural gas trucks that are being used. And frankly, this was done for business reasons, economic reasons. Why? Because when diesel cost $4.50 a gallon, and natural gas, low price of natural gas cost an equivalent retail level at $2.50 a gallon, there's a huge driver. And given the number of miles these trucks run, about 100,000 miles, long haul trucking, 100,000 miles a year, that differential is enough to drive towards liquefied natural gas, because the payback period for the retrofits of the truck or the new trucks that they're going to be built with LNG tanks, as well as the refueling stations, the infrastructure, for both of them, the payback period is a couple of years at the most. And so this became a huge driver for LNG trucking. And in fact, some of it is regulatory, because if you go to the LA port, Los Angeles port, they wanted to reduce emissions out there, and they were driving towards turning your trucks into natural gas trucks so that the emissions go down. So both a little bit of regulatory, but a large economic reason. Now, when diesel cost is, as we now know, when the oil prices come down, that driver has gone away. And no one thinks that the price of oil is going to stay this low for a very long term. It's going to go up. But at this point, I would say that the use of natural gas in transportation is quite small. It's not likely to grow at a rate that people had predicted. At least when some of us were in Washington, this was being looked at as a fast growing, but that's not going to happen because of the low price of gas. There are a few other things that we briefly discussed, and I'll touch upon that, is that now that the chemical industry is coming back, is it going to be the same industry as we had before? And the previous industry were all about big centralized plants. You can see them, refineries and all that, huge plants, and there were economies of scale. But economies of scale also brings, when you have a large plant, you have an exposure, the capital that you need to build that exposes you to certain risks. And we have seen that in the nuclear industry, which is why the drive towards small modular reactors. So the same thing may happen, and there's a lot of discussion going on, that maybe there's an optimal in terms of risk. Maybe you don't have to build such a big plant. Maybe you can get to small modular chemical plants that can actually be in a distributed way. Frankly, if there's a lot of natural gas being flared out in North Dakota, maybe you want to put a small modular reactor out there to do something with it and value add, and then transport the value add. So that's the kind of thing that may actually happen. The Gas Technology Institute is creating an initiative just on this particular thing. And finally, which is really a research problem, is can you convert gas to liquids? And there's a lot of work that has already been done in the industry. Fischer-Tropsch process to convert gas to liquids. Shell, for example, has invested huge amount of money in plants in Qatar to do that. In fact, it went over budget. Are there better ways to do it to make it more cost effective? And frankly, I don't think we know the answer to that, which is where research is needed. And this is some two peripheral issues, but the main discussion was really about power sector, manufacturing, and briefly on transportation. Let me stop here. Happy to answer questions.
Maybe we could take questions from both of you guys at the same
Yep.
time. Does that work? Okay.
Taxi.
And then I'm going to.
I'll just hand over the hard questions to Tony.
Thanks.
So like normal, we'll start off with students. So students who have questions, please go ahead and ask. Yeah? Okay, how about back there? Yeah.
I was just gonna ask, how do you feel it's like, if we ever get to the point where we actually have a gas tax, how is that gonna affect the natural gas industry? You mentioned the growth of like the chemical industry. How do you see that changing if there's a gas tax?
You mean gasoline tax?
I'm sorry, I mean a carbon tax.
A carbon tax. Well, I think, first of all, love to see a carbon tax. I think it may, so there's a lot of analysis that has been done as to how much additional cost it'll create for natural gas related things like power sector. I think the biggest displacement that'll happen, even faster, will be coal. And because of the carbon tax, because the emissions are so much larger. Yeah. The implications, and it will level the playing field between coal on one hand and make renewables even more attractive. frankly, in the near term, I don't think it's going to, it could benefit the natural gas, but because of the fact that the lower emissions from coal. So now coal is about 30+%, 34, 35%. It's going to go down more rapidly than one would think. And it'll be occupied mostly by natural gas and some by renewables.
Thank you.
I don't know if, Tony, if you...
Yeah, pretty much I agree. Yeah.
Okay, how about way back there in the back with the pledge? Yeah.
Sure. People are getting pretty excited about stationary energy storage. I'd be curious to your perspective, given all this additional capacity, particularly with natural gas in the market and this ability to spin up fairly quickly. My guess is that you're fairly bearish on it, but I'd be interested in your perspective.
So, stationary storage, I suppose you mean battery and the likes, right? So you have to ask the question, if there is intermittency, what's the most cost-effective way to address the intermittency? And is there a stacking order to doing things? If it's centralized, frankly, natural gas turbines and balancing out the intermittency is actually not a bad way to do it. But is there something even cheaper than that we don't do today? And let me give you one answer. Our electricity grid has been going on for the last 100+ years, where the generation always follows the load. If you turn on the switch, somewhere, generation has to ramp up a little bit, right? And that is because the generation were essentially like baseload power. Now with the generation going up and down, the cheapest way to handle, which we don't do today, is to control the load without compromising services. Right? You want the lighting. If it dims a little bit, it's okay. But a little bit out here can make a gigawatt of difference somewhere else, right? And so that we don't do today because we don't have the infrastructure. The grid did not have the IT infrastructure to do it. So that's the cheapest way. The second cheapest way is to look at storage options. Okay? And that's where, whether it's a heat storage, frankly, that could be much cheaper, thermal storage, or electricity storage. What we're finding in the electricity storage are the cost of batteries, and in particular lithium-ion batteries. It's coming down at a rate much faster than we thought. And today, a battery pack is about $350, $400 a kilowatt hour. It's expected to go down to sub $200 by the end of this decade. And then it becomes a really viable approach to do a lot of things. I just came back from Hawaii, not for vacation, for work. Because Hawaii has this humongous problem with electricity of they use diesel to produce electricity, and the rates are like 35 cents a kilowatt hour. In that case, PV panel plus batteries make sense today. And that's what's sort of going on, the transformation.
I guess the thing that I would add, in addition to cost, we probably should think about the climate effects and actually think, so if you say I'm going to have a battery storage solution, you probably should compute the life cycle CO2 associated with that battery storage solution, because that may be an instructive, metric to know, what's the actual carbon footprint of, mining some material somewhere, maybe in Mongolia, transporting it someplace, right, transforming it. So we should just know those numbers. That would be a good number to know.
Super quick follow-up. I just wasn't clear where you put natural gas within that stacking order, other than like isolated energy islands.
Depends whether you have a carbon price or not. You have a carbon price, batteries, would make sense because it has, very little carbon implication on its own,
yeah,
right? Except for mining, etc., right? On the other hand, if you have carbon tax or carbon price, or any price, and you have natural gas for balancing, well, you have to pay for it then. So one has to do the numbers. I can't give you exactly which one, how the stacking order may change depending on the carbon price.
Okay, more students. Okay, you in the red shirt back
Yeah,
there.
just had a quick question on how you view gas exports and the ban on the gas exports, and how a change in that might affect electricity pricing and domestic production, I guess.
Well, so Arun told you about this renaissance in manufacturing in the US. It's really being driven by not only low gas prices, but by basically, the C2, C3, C4 hydrocarbons, so, ethane, propane, butane. So there are a lot of proponents on developing, export. of natural gas, but again, I think we should have a holistic sort of a look at what does it mean for this, industry that's coming back. Are we going to chop its legs off? I think that would be a very bad idea.
Transportation costs of products from China to the US. If you manufacture them here, you don't have to.
Right.
And natural gas, when if you do LNG, there's an energy hit there as well, right? So probably we should think about that as well. It's not maybe as attractive, when there's an energy hit to liquefy the natural gas and transport it.
So I was asked this question, the one that you asked, directly in a hearing, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And because this was going around, I said, what if we start exporting natural gas and would our prices go up and the American people will suffer from that? And the best answer I could give at that time was, this is a great question, Mr. Senator. I'll come back with a better answer. We have to do a holistic analysis of that. And I got out of the hearing. So there was an analysis actually done on this, on the economics of exports and how. And I think you got to look at the numbers of how much export are we talking about compared to how much production. And for most of the export that are being considered, the impact on the price is actually quite small. Okay, so that's the first thing. The other thing you ought to realize is that we have free trade agreements between the United States and Canada on one side and Mexico on the other. So if they require natural gas, I believe under the free trade agreement, we'll have to provide them, right? They can export it. So I think if you look at it holistically, the impact on prices, unless it goes up by an enormous amount, much more than what people had predicted, the impact on price could be quite low because of the fact that if you export a lot, the prices on the other side would go down. And the cost of exporting LNG is about $5 to $6 a million BTU. So the price that you have out here, which is about $4, add $6 to it, that's $10. Now that's the remaining is margin, but if you export, that price may come down and you may equilibrate. So it may not be that much of an impact.
Okay, how about you, way in the back there, and then Debbie?
Yeah, so you talked about the price of solar and wind, like renewables, per kilowatt hour dropping to at times being lower than the price for natural gas, and I'm wondering, so what then? How is it making economic sense to be using natural gas when the wind is actually potentially lower than that?
Great question. So you have to remember that wind today has a production tax credit, okay, which keeps coming and then going away, coming and going away. So if you're a utility, you got to sort of hedge your bets because you cannot count on it. If it goes away, the price of electricity goes from $30 a megawatt hour to about $45. It's still cheap, okay? So that's one thing. And solar today has a federal tax credit of 30%, investment tax credit, which will go down to 10% in 2017. Okay, so the price will go up, but by that time, the efficiency of the cells will go up, the total overall cost of installing will come down. Now, the challenge in solar and wind is eventually, long term, it's not going to be the cost because it'll be cheap. It's the integration to the grid. The grid was never designed for intermittent sources coming on, on board and then having system operators play this game. It was never designed for that. And I think that's the biggest challenge. It's not the long term, it's not the cost of electricity production. And that's where natural gas becomes attractive because you can ramp up the turbine anytime you want.
Okay, we'll open it up to everybody now. Okay, all right, how about up here? Yeah.
What about the distribution of natural gas in terms of its infrastructure? What is being done, what should be done to make natural gas useful throughout the country in terms of distribution?
Yeah, I don't know if I had enough discussion on the distribution infrastructure, at least in this panel. So one of the things is that the infrastructure, we have 60 million homes in the United States which has access to gas. But in many cases, as we now see, that infrastructure is old, and this was some data measured in Boston, it is very leaky. And I think that modernizing that infrastructure is a critical need. Otherwise, I think, what's the number? If it's more than 4% leakage, the benefit, the climate benefits of
3%.
3%. The climate benefits of
3% for electricity.
3% for electricity.
It's like 1% or even half of that for transportation.
For transportation, right. So, if it's leaky, then the climate benefits of using natural gas for power goes away. And I think that's a huge, and we had lots of discussions on that, on how to detect the leaks, et cetera. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In terms of the infrastructure, probably the most important thing would be to assure that it's not leaking, and that there's a lot of details about how valves switch and things like that, and not to have valves vent methane when they switch.
Are there major new pipelines going in? We, of course, are interested in gas pipelines around here, say to cover the east, or is it still mainly the small?
We did discuss that, because we had the CEO of New England ISO, Independent System Operator, with us in the meeting. He was a panelist, Gordon Van Wiley. And he brought up the issue that, who pays for it? Who pays for this infrastructure? Are there other hurdles to building it? And will the market take care of it? It turns out market will not take care of it, because there are permitting and regulatory issues that are preventing them to build that infrastructure in. I think the financing of it can be done, but there are other hurdles to building that infrastructure in the Northeast. And that's the biggest challenge for the Northeast right now.
Okay, how about we'll go to the middle there, and then we'll come to you, and then that will be it.
Could you say more about winter in Boston? Is the problem the pipe, or is the problem the storage at both ends? I mean, if winter comes, if the temperature goes, there's fluctuations on a daily or weekly scale, but it doesn't fluctuate coming out of the ground.
No, so if it is a cold winter, the demand for natural gas for heating goes up. And there's not enough throughput in the piping structure. And I'm not sure there's enough storage to handle it. And that's why the price actually, I wish I could show that the data, the price goes up because of the temperature going down. That's really the issue.
Okay, I heard right before we go to you, there's one more back there. Who is back there?
No, I was just pointing out that Rob Jackson's back here. If you have
Okay, yeah, Rob Jackson is one of the world's experts on leaky pipelines. So.
Volunteer myself.
Put him on the spot.
Just very briefly, I thought maybe the question was about the Boston case. So, led by Harvard, we just published a paper a month or two ago that showed the total emissions for the Boston Metroplex were 2.5 times higher than the state thought they were. And we know that based on the buildup of methane in the air over city and the ratio of methane to ethane in the city. I think most of it's coming from natural gas infrastructure. When you see methane, you want to see ethane too, and that is in fact what we found. So I guess the remaining question is where is it coming from? Some of it certainly from the pipelines, but we're also looking at downstream applications, incomplete burning at furnaces, say. There's some additional work that's going on. But for an old city like Boston, the inventories underestimate the real emissions.
Okay, all right, and the last question.
Was there any conversation about CNG, particularly for transportation, and the low-cost compressors and the storage that RPE is working on, and what impact that might have? And secondly, any discussion about converting methane to biodegradable plastic, which is another area?
On the former one, we didn't have too much of a discussion on CNG for transportation. I think we talked briefly about fleets, but that's about it. But I don't know whether it was discussed at the panel or whether it's my memory from RPE. But I mean, it makes sense for the fleets. but it doesn't make sense for light-duty vehicles unless the cost comes down dramatically.
And it doesn't make any CO2 sense at all.
Yeah, from the leakage, if it leaks, it doesn't make sense at all, right? So yeah, exactly. So that's on the CNG. What was the last one?
Biodegradable.
Methane to using bioreactors to biodegradable plastic. There's work going on here at Stanford and other places.
Yeah, we didn't discuss it. I don't think we discussed that in any of our panels. But of course, in ARPA-E, there are programs dedicated for these methanotroughs, eating methane and pooping out plastics and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I'd just like to, can I borrow your mic?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm so pleased that these guys agreed to talk about this because, Stanford has launched this new initiative and, I know that it's controversial and I would say that, there's not general agreement amongst the faculty and the students that, this is an area that really has potential in the long run. But I do believe it's, clearly that there are many good reasons to consider using natural gas. There are also risks. So we hope this is really just the beginning of a long and deep conversation about the issue of using this resource as a bridge, as a transition fuel. So please keep the conversation going. It would be terrible if here in our own community we couldn't really fully vet these issues and share from each other's perspectives. So thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers.